On the night of December 29th, 1876, the temperature outside had dropped to 45 degrees below zero and was still falling. Sigrid Lindqvist was reading a book, not huddled over it, not clutching it for warmth or comfort, not using it as a distraction from the sound of the wind screaming across the Nebraska prairie above her head. Simply reading it, the way a person reads when they have warmth and light and no immediate reason for fear. The oil lamp on the small table cast a steady amber circle across the pages. The cast iron stove in the corner radiated a quiet, patient heat that required nothing from her except a small log every few hours. The walls around her were earth, packed and solid and ancient in their indifference to the chaos above. 3/4 of a mile to the northwest, Gunnar Holberg was burning his dining table to keep his family from freezing to death. She could not see this, she could not know it yet, but she would learn it soon enough. And when she did, she would remember what he had said to her 47 days earlier. Standing in November sunlight with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular expression of a man who has already decided he is right. Two orphan children digging their own graves. That was what he had called it. That was what he had called her and her brother, and the hole they were cutting into a hillside with borrowed tools and two teenage boys who thought she was peculiar. Now Gunnar was feeding furniture to a stove that could not keep pace with the cold, and Sigrid was turning pages in a room that held at 53 degrees Fahrenheit without effort. The thermometer on the wall confirmed it, 53 degrees, the same temperature the earth held at 6 feet down winter and summer, regardless of what the sky decided to do. Her mother had told her that. Her mother had told her many things. Beside the stove, curled on a wool blanket, a gray dog with wolf-marked fur lifted his head briefly. His ears rotated towards some sound too distant for human hearing, some frequency of wind or pressure that only animals could detect. Then he settled back down, nose tucked under his tail, and continued his patient watch. His name was Fenrir, named for the great wolf of Norse mythology. He had been with them since the beginning. He would stay until the end. At the other end of the dugout, her brother Torsten sat at a makeshift desk. His pen moved steadily across the pages of a composition book, recording temperatures the way other boys his age might record baseball scores or the names of girls they admired. He was 15 years old, and he understood something that most 15-year-old boys did not understand. Data was proof, and proof was the only argument that mattered. Outside, the blizzard had been building for 6 hours. The sound it made was not the familiar whistle of prairie wind through wooden boards, not the rattling of window glass in a drafty frame house. It was something beneath sound, a pressure change felt in the chest before the ears processed it, the sensation of the atmosphere itself reorganizing its weight. Sigrid had checked her thermometer near the ventilation gap that afternoon and watched it drop 11 degrees in 40 minutes. Then she had come inside, confirmed the chimney was drawing cleanly, checked her wood supply, and picked up her book. She was 17 years old. She had built this dugout herself with her brother's help and two teenage boys who thought she was peculiar. Total cost $198. She had arrived at this quarter section of Nebraska territory land in mid-November with no construction experience, no family except Torsten, no neighbors who believed she would survive, and a plan she had been developing in the back of her mind for the better part of 2 years. The plan was working. But to understand why she was reading a book while the wind tried to kill everything above ground, you have to go back to April. You have to go back to the cholera. You have to go back to the day her mother died. Britta Lindqvist came to Nebraska from a family of builders and farmers in the Dalarna region of Sweden. People who understood in the practical and unsentimental way of those who work with their hands that the land itself was a resource to be read rather than conquered. She had married twice. First to a quiet man named Anders Lindqvist, who died of a fever before Sigrid was old enough to remember his face. A man who existed now only in stories and in the shape of her own cheekbones when she looked in a mirror. Then to a man named Silas Harmon. He owned a claim on the eastern edge of Pembroke County and who in the early years of the marriage had seemed solid and capable and sufficient. He was not cruel exactly. He was something worse than cruel. He was the kind of man who viewed the women and children in his household as extensions of his property, rather than as people with separate interests. The kind of man who experienced any expression of independent thought from either category as a form of disrespect, a challenge to his authority that required correction. Britta had understood this about him before long, and she had made accommodations in the way that women of her generation and circumstance often did. Outwardly compliant, inwardly preparing, she had saved money from selling eggs to the trading post at Fort Hartshorn, coin by coin over 4 years, building a reserve that Silas did not know existed because he had never asked where the egg money went, and Britta had never told him. She had pressed that money $250 in total between the pages of her Swedish Bible, along with 4 sheets of paper covered in her careful handwriting. A formula for clay lining a chimney pipe, 3 parts clay to 1 part fine sand to 1 part dried grass fiber. A list of 3 families who could be trusted. The name of the land office clerk who handled homestead filings, without asking unnecessary questions. And one final line written in the margin of the last page, in handwriting that trembled slightly, as if the hand that wrote it knew it might be the last thing it ever wrote. If you are reading this, I am gone. Do not stay with Silas. Build into a south-facing hillside. I have taught you everything you need to know. Britta Lindqvist had known what was coming. She had not been able to stop it, but she had been able to prepare her daughter for it, which was the only form of protection she had access to. She died on April 14th, 1876. The cholera outbreak moved through Pembroke County in 3 weeks and left 21 people dead. Britta was the 17th. The spring that year had come early with flooding along the creek beds and standing water in the low fields. The kind of spring that old-timers watched with worried eyes because they knew what standing water meant. It meant sickness. It meant death moving through the county like an invisible hand touching some houses and passing over others according to a logic that no one could predict or prevent. The first case appeared in early April. A farmer named Hendricks who lived 3 miles south of the Harmon claim. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. Britta began showing symptoms on April 10th. 4 days later, she was dead. Sigrid was 16 years old. She sat beside her mother's bed for the last 4 hours, holding a hand that grew colder by degrees. The room was small and close and smelled of sickness in the particular way that cholera smells. A sweetness underneath the other odors that Sigrid would never be able to forget as long as she lived. Torsten sat on the other side of the bed, silent, his 14-year-old face carrying a weight no child should have to carry. Fenrir lay at the foot of the bed. His gray muzzle rested on his paws. His eyes moved between Britta's face and Sigrid's face with the focused attention of an animal who understood that something was ending. He refused to leave, even when Silas ordered him out, even when Dorothea, who would become Silas's second wife 5 months later, tried to drag him by the collar. The dog would not move. He knew what was happening. He had known since the sickness began. Britta had found him 3 years earlier, a half-starved pup with wolf blood in his veins. Abandoned by a trapper who had decided the animal was more trouble than he was worth, left to die in a ditch alongside a muddy road in early spring. Britta had brought him home wrapped in her shawl. She had nursed him back to health with broth and scraps and the patient attention of a woman who understood that broken things could be mended if you gave them time. She had named him Fenrir for the great wolf of Norse mythology, and she had watched him grow into a creature of fierce loyalty and quiet intelligence. A protector, a companion, a friend in a household where friends were few. Now he watched his first mistress die with eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. The afternoon wore on. The light through the window changed from the hard white of midday to the softer gold of late afternoon. Britta drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breathing grew shallow, irregular. The pauses between breaths stretched longer and longer. In the final hour, her grip tightened briefly. Her eyes, which had been closed for most of the afternoon, opened and found Sigrid's face. There was clarity in them, a sudden startling clarity that pushed through the fog of sickness and exhaustion and pain. The earth has a memory longer than men. Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound that Sigrid had to lean close to catch. 6 feet down, it holds 52 degrees forever. She paused, drew a breath that rattled in her chest. Remember that. Her eyes moved to Torsten. The boy sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his face a mask that was trying very hard not to break. Take care of each other. Then to Fenrir. The dog lifted his head when her gaze found him. His ears pricked forward. His tail gave a single slow wag. Good boy. Her hand relaxed, and she was gone. The room held its silence for a long moment. The April light coming through the window did not change. The world outside continued its business as if nothing had happened. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. Life went on indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in this small room, in this small corner of Nebraska territory. But everything had happened. Everything that would come after. Every decision Sigrid would make in the months that followed. Every stake she would drive into that hillside. Every brick of sod she would cut and stack. Every argument she would have with neighbors who told her she was foolish. All of it traced back to this moment, to a hand going slack in hers, to a mother's final words about the temperature of the earth, to the understanding settling into her chest like a stone that she was now responsible for herself and her brother in a world that did not particularly care whether they survived. Silas Harmon did not waste time on grief. The day after Britta was buried in the small cemetery behind the church at Fort Hartshorn, he was already making plans. Plans that did not include his stepchildren. He remarried 5 months later, a widow from 2 claims over named Dorothea. She was 10 years younger than Silas. Pleasant enough in public, quick to smile at neighbors, quick to help with church suppers and community events. But in private, she was something else. She looked at Sigrid and Torsten the way a person looks at furniture that has come with a house they did not particularly want. Items to be tolerated, obstacles to be worked around, competition for attention and resources and eventual inheritance. She made no secret of her preference for a household that did not include them. Small slights accumulated over the summer and into the fall. Meals where their portions were noticeably smaller. Chores that multiplied while praise disappeared. Conversations that stopped when they entered a room. The message was clear, even when the words were polite. You are not wanted here. You never were. By the time November arrived, the arrangement had become unsustainable. Silas called Sigrid into the main room one evening after supper. The fire was burning low in the hearth. The November wind was rattling the windows in their frames. Dorothea sat in the corner doing needlework, her face carefully neutral. Silas stood by the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at Sigrid the way a man looks at a problem he is about to solve. There is a widower near Fort Hartshorn. His voice was matter of fact. The voice of a man describing a business transaction. His name is Cornelius Pruitt, 48 years old, decent land, looking for a young wife to manage his household and bear him children. Sigrid felt something cold move through her chest. I have already spoken with him, Silas continued as if he were discussing the sale of a horse. The arrangement is favorable. You would be settled by spring, provided for. He paused. You can accept it and be married before Christmas. His eyes met hers. Or you can make your own way in the world. The words hung in the air between them. But either choice, you and your brother cannot remain on my claim past the end of this month. Dorothea's needle moved steadily through her fabric. She did not look up. She did not need to. Sigrid stood in the doorway of the main room, absorbing the words. Not arguing, not pleading, not crying, simply receiving the information the way you receive news of weather. It was coming. There was no point in objecting to its arrival. Silas watched her face for a reaction and found none. This seemed to unsettle him more than tears or protest would have. You understand what I am telling you. It was not a question. It was a demand for confirmation. Sigrid nodded once. I understand. She turned and walked to her room. Her footsteps were steady on the wooden floor. Her spine was straight. Her hands did not shake. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Torsten was standing in the hallway when she came out. His face was pale in the lamplight, but his jaw was set in a way she recognized. The same expression their mother had worn when she was making a decision that could not be unmade. He had been listening at the door. He had heard everything. We are not staying. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a boy who had grown up fast in the months since April. And you are not marrying that man. Sigrid looked at her brother, at the set of his shoulders, at the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He was 15 years old. He had lost his mother 6 months ago. And he was standing in a hallway telling his sister that they were going to walk away from the only security they had ever known, because the alternative was worse. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. No, I am not. That night, after the house had gone quiet and the only sounds were the wind outside and the settling of logs in the dying fire, Sigrid went to her room and opened her mother's Bible. Fenrir followed her as he always did, settling at her feet while she turned the pages. His presence was a comfort she did not acknowledge aloud but felt in her bones, the weight of him against her ankles, the steady rhythm of his breathing in the quiet room, the gray fur warm against her skin. She turned the pages carefully. Psalms, Proverbs. And there, pressed between the thin sheets of paper, she found what her mother had left for her. $250 in carefully folded bills. It was more money than she had ever held in her hands. More money than she had imagined her mother possessed. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, trying to understand how Britta had accumulated this sum without Silas knowing. Trying to calculate how many eggs it represented, how many small transactions at the trading post, how many years of patient secret saving, coin by coin, dollar by dollar, building a future that she knew she might not live to see, but that her daughter might need. Then Sigrid found the letters, 4 pages of her mother's handwriting, dense with information that only made sense now. The first page contained the clay formula, 3 parts clay to 1 part fine sand to 1 part dried grass fiber, mixed with water to the consistency of thick cream, applied to the interior of a stovepipe in layers, each layer dried before the next was added. She had watched her mother make this mixture, had helped her apply it to the chimney pipe in the root cellar behind their house in Minnesota years ago, before they came to Nebraska. She had not understood at the time why her mother was teaching her this particular skill. Now she understood. The second page contained a list of trusted families, 3 names, the Petersons, who had more sons than they had work for and who might be willing to hire out labor for reasonable wages. The Mercers, who had helped Britta when she first arrived in Nebraska territory and who could be counted on in an emergency. The Tates, whose patriarch had been trading furs on the plains for 25 years and who understood the land better than anyone. The third page contained the name of the land office clerk, a man named Hendricks who handled homestead filings and who, according to Britta's careful notes, did not ask questions about applicants as long as the paperwork was in order. He did not look closely at signatures. He did not question initials. He processed documents and moved on to the next one because that was his job and he had no particular interest in doing more than his job required. And the fourth page, that final page, Sigrid held it in her hands and read the words that her mother had written in handwriting that trembled at the edges. "If you are reading this, I am gone." The words blurred for a moment. Sigrid blinked. Do not stay with Silas. Her mother had known, had always known, had been preparing for this day while pretending that it would never come. Build into a south-facing hillside, the root cellar, the temperature underground, the lessons about earth and heat and the way mass held temperature steady while the air above it went wild. I have taught you everything you need to know. Sigrid sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, running her finger over the handwriting, feeling the particular weight of a person's absence in the specific shapes they had pressed into paper. Her mother had written the formula for clay lining a chimney pipe because she knew Sigrid would need to build a chimney. She had written down the names of trusted families because she knew Sigrid would need help. She had noted the land office clerk because she knew Sigrid would need to file a claim. She had known even then that this was where things were heading, and she had written down everything her daughter would need to survive it. That was not grief what Sigrid felt in that moment. It was something harder and more durable. It was the understanding that she had been loved carefully and practically, in the way that costs the most and leaves the most behind. Fenrir lifted his head and rested his muzzle on her knee. His eyes, gold brown and ancient, looked up at her with something that might have been understanding. She placed her hand on his head, felt the warmth of him, the steady presence. We are leaving tomorrow. The dog's tail moved once against the floor, a single thump of acknowledgement. He would go where she went. He always had. They left before dawn, before Silas or Dorothea were awake, before the first gray light had touched the horizon, before anyone could ask questions or offer objections or try to stop them. The November air hit their faces like a flat hand as they stepped outside. Cold, sharp, the kind of cold that makes you understand immediately that the world does not care whether you survive it. Sigrid carried her mother's Bible in a small pack. The money was still pressed between its pages along with the 4 sheets of instructions. She had memorized the important parts already, but she wanted the papers close. She wanted to be able to touch her mother's handwriting if she needed to. Torsten carried a larger pack with tools and provisions, a handsaw, A hammer, a knife, dried meat and hardtack, enough to last them a few days if they were careful. Fenrir walked between them, his gray fur silver in the pre-dawn darkness. His ears rotated constantly, tracking sounds that human ears could not detect. He knew something was happening, something important, and he was ready. They did not look back. Not once, not at the house where they had lived for 4 years, not at the barn where Torsten had learned to care for animals, not at the small plot of ground where Britta was buried 3 miles away in the churchyard at Fort Hartshorn. Looking back would not change anything, and they had a long way to walk. 13 miles to the land office in Fort Hartshorn, 13 miles over frozen roads and empty prairie, 13 miles to walk before noon if they wanted to file their claim before the office closed. They walked in silence for the first hour. The sun came up behind them, pale and cold, in a sky that promised nothing. The prairie stretched out on all sides, brown and gray and endless. No trees, no shelter, nothing but grass and sky and the thin ribbon of road disappearing into the distance. Torsten spoke first. "Do you know where we are going?" His voice was steady, curious rather than afraid. Sigrid nodded. "I know." She had studied maps at the trading post, had asked questions of settlers who came through, had identified three-quarter sections that might have what she needed. A south-facing hillside, access to water, soil that would hold together when cut into bricks. She had been planning this for 2 years in the back of her mind without ever admitting to herself that she was planning it. Now the plan was becoming real. "And what will we do when we get there?" Torsten asked. "We will build." "Build what?" Sigrid looked at her brother, at his young face pinched with cold, at his eyes steady and trusting. "Something that will keep us alive." They reached Fort Hartshorn shortly before noon. The town was small and rough and practical. A main street of wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a land office with a faded sign above the door. People moved along the sidewalks, bundled against the cold, going about their business, without paying attention to the two young people and the gray dog walking in from the east. Sigrid found the land office and pushed open the door. The interior was small and dusty and smelled of ink and paper and the particular staleness of rooms where important documents were kept. A clerk sat behind a counterhead bent over a ledger. He was a tired-looking man with ink stains on his collar and the resigned expression of someone who had processed too many documents to care about the contents of any particular one. He did not look up when they entered. He finished writing whatever he was writing, turned a page, made another notation. Then finally he raised his eyes. "Yes, I would like to file a homestead claim." Sigrid's voice was steady. She had practiced this in her mind during the long walk. The clerk glanced at her without interest, pulled a form from a stack, dipped his pen in ink. Name S. Lindqvist. She said it clearly, spelled it when he asked, watched him write it down in the ledger without looking up. The Homestead Act made no distinction between male and female applicants in its written text. Whatever distinctions the men administering it preferred to make in practice, this clerk was too tired or too indifferent to make them. He saw the initial and the last name. He saw the signature. He asked no questions. He handed her the receipt. She was a legal homesteader before noon. Torsten stood beside her on the wooden sidewalk outside the land office, squinting against the pale November sun. Fenrir sat at their feet, watching the unfamiliar street with wary attention. His ears moved constantly, tracking the sounds of wagons and voices and the normal business of a small town going about its day. "Now what?" Torsten's voice was quiet, not afraid, simply asking. Sigrid looked at the receipt in her hand, at the description of the quarter section that was now legally hers to prove up. 160 acres of Nebraska territory, assigned to S. Lindqvist, requiring 5 years of residence and improvement to become permanent property. "Now we find our land." She folded the receipt and put it in her pack. "And then we build something that will keep us alive." She had chosen her quarter section carefully, more carefully than any of her future neighbors would realize or credit. Most of the settled claims in the Fort Hartshorn area ran along the river bottomlands or spread across the flat prairie in the way that timber frame houses demanded, oriented toward the road, square against the horizon, standing upright against everything the weather chose to throw at them. That was how things were done. That was how things had always been done. And Sigrid had spent 2 years watching how things that were done the way they had always been done performed in Nebraska winters. She had watched Gunnar Holberg's second house collapse under the weight of snow that accumulated on a roof pitched too shallow for the climate. She had watched Heinrich Brenner's beautiful stone house sweat moisture onto its interior walls every winter because stone conducted heat outward with merciless efficiency. She had watched the painted frame houses shudder in the wind and seen their owners nail additional boards over the siding every fall in a losing battle against the gaps that opened as the wood dried and contracted. She had paid attention, and she had noticed something that most people seem to have forgotten. Her mother's root cellar dug into a hillside maintained its temperature through every extreme the seasons offered. 52 degrees in January, 52 degrees in July. The vegetables stored in it never froze, never rotted. The interior stayed stable while the world above it went mad with heat or cold. Not because of any elaborate system, but because the earth itself at depth held its temperature with a stubbornness that no wooden wall could match. Sigrid walked her quarter section twice before she made any marks, covering the ground in a methodical grid, noting where water pooled after rain, where the grass grew thicker because the soil held more moisture, where the wind came from, and where the land offered any interruption to it. Torsten walked beside her, silent, watching her process without understanding it yet, but learning, always learning. Fenrir ranged ahead of them, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to investigate something that caught his attention. A rabbit hole, a snake track, the scent of something that had passed through recently, then circling back to check on his people before ranging ahead again. The south-facing hillside at the back of her quarter section was not obvious. It was not large, a modest rise in otherwise flat land. The kind of feature a person could walk past without registering if they were focused on road access or timber potential or any of the things that experienced settlers had been trained to look for. But Sigrid was not looking for what experienced settlers had been trained to look for. She was looking for what her mother had taught her to look for. A slope that faced the sun, soil that would hold together when cut, enough elevation to prevent water from pooling at the entrance, enough depth to dig into without hitting rock. She found it on her second pass across the land, a gentle rise at the northern edge of her section. South-facing, the grass grew thicker there than anywhere else because the soil held more warmth and more moisture. The snow would melt faster there in spring, the ground would thaw earlier, and 6 feet below the surface, the temperature would hold steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit winter and summer, regardless of what the sky decided to do. She drove her survey stakes into the hillside with a borrowed hammer. Torsten helped her measure, calling out distances while she marked positions. Fenrir watched from a nearby rise a gray sentinel against the pale sky, and they began to plan. The first person to challenge the plan arrived the following afternoon. Gunnar Holberg was 47 years old, Norwegian by blood, American by circumstance, built like a man who had been doing physical labor since before he was old enough to call it work. He had been in Nebraska territory for 5 years, longer than almost anyone else in the immediate area, and he wore that seniority with the quiet authority of someone who had earned it through difficulty rather than inheritance. He had lost 2 houses. His first to a prairie fire that swept through the county in the summer of 1873, 4 hours from spark to ash. Everything he owned reduced to a black smear on the prairie. His second to a snow load that buckled the roof during the terrible winter of 1874. He had watched the timbers crack, heard the sound like a gunshot as the ridge beam failed. Barely got his family out before the whole structure came down. He was on his third house now, a timber frame structure that had cost him $480 in lumber hauled up from the railroad depot, plus another $100 in labor. And he was proud of it. The way a man is proud of something that cost him more than he could afford and stood up anyway. He rode over when he saw the survey stakes, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had somewhere to be but was choosing to make a detour. His horse was a sturdy mare, well-fed patient under him. He sat his horse for a moment, looking at the stakes, at the girl standing among them, at the boy beside her, at the gray dog that had risen to its feet, ears forward, watching him with unsettling attention. His expression was not hostile, but it was something adjacent to it, the focused appraisal of someone trying to understand what they were seeing before they reacted to it. He swung down from the saddle. "You are planning to build into the hillside." It was not a question. His voice was deep and certain, the voice of a man accustomed to being right. 8 feet back. That is what your stakes indicate. Sigrid said nothing. She had learned in her years in Silas Harmon's household that silence was often more powerful than argument, that men who expected women to defend themselves often did not know how to respond when no defense was offered. She simply stood there, waiting. Gunnar covered his concerns in the order they occurred to him. The weight of the earth above the structure would collapse the roof. The chimney placement underground would not draw properly. The cold air would sink into the hole and pool there. She would freeze before January. They both would. The boy and the dog, too, probably. He said all of this with the confidence of a man who had survived 5 Nebraska winters, who had watched the weather perform, who knew what it could do, and who did not believe that a 17-year-old girl with no construction experience could outthink it. Sigrid answered each point in the order he raised it. Her voice was calm, factual, without any trace of the defensiveness that he was clearly expecting. Support timbers properly sized and spaced could carry the roof load she was planning. She had calculated it based on the mining engineering manual she had read at the Fort Hartshorn trading post. A clay-lined chimney running at a 30-degree angle through the hillside before emerging 12 feet above the roofline would draw efficiently. The thermal differential between the interior and the exterior would create natural draft. And the earth at a depth of 6 feet maintained a temperature of approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the surface temperature was doing, because the earth had more mass than the air, and mass resisted temperature change in proportion to its quantity. Gunnar listened to this with the patience of a man who had decided in advance of the conversation that he was right. His expression did not change. His arms remained crossed over his chest. He asked where she planned to get the money for support timbers. She told him. He asked about ventilation. She explained the door gap system and the chimney arrangement. He said that the cold would still find her, that Nebraska winters were not problems to be solved with clever arrangements of dirt, that she needed what everyone needed: thick walls, a good stove, plenty of wood. He paused then, and something shifted in his face. A brief interior weather change that came and went too quickly for her to read fully. He started to say something about his grandfather back in Minnesota, began a sentence that might have been useful, and stopped it before it finished forming. The way people sometimes stop themselves from offering information that would undermine a position they have already committed to. He put his hat back on. 2 orphan children digging their own graves. His voice was flat now, final, the voice of a man pronouncing judgment. You will both be dead before January, and no one will be surprised. Fenrir growled, low and soft, not aggressive, just a warning, a reminder that these children were not as alone as they appeared. Gunnar glanced at the dog, at those wolf gold eyes, at the way the animal had positioned itself between him and Sigrid without seeming to move at all. Then he looked at Sigrid, at Torsten, at the stakes in the ground. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word, and Sigrid went back to work. What she did not say to Gunnar because he had not asked, and she had not yet learned the strategic value of selective disclosure, was that she had been planning this for the better part of 2 years. Not the specific location, not the specific measurements, but the general principle. She had spent the months since her mother's decline watching the established settlers around her with the focused attention of someone taking a test whose results would determine whether she lived or died. She had watched, and she had learned, and she had remembered. She had also spent time talking to people the established settlers did not consider worth talking to. There was an old Lakota man who came through the area twice a year with furs and trade goods. If you sat with him long enough and asked the right questions, he would describe the earth lodges his people had lived in before the treaties pushed them west. Structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer, built from materials that cost nothing but labor. There was a French-Canadian trapper named Bellevaux, 71 years old, who had spent 20 winters in a dugout on the Platte River. His lungs were clear, his joints were sound. He said the secret was moisture management and nothing more complicated than that. And there was a shelf at the Fort Hartshorn trading post where people left and traded books. Sigrid had read everything on it: farm journals, immigrant guides, and most usefully, an engineering manual someone had abandoned that contained a chapter on mineshaft construction. A chapter that described the thermal behavior of underground spaces with more precision than she had encountered anywhere else. She was not experimenting blindly. She was synthesizing, taking knowledge from every source that offered it, ignoring the boundaries that other people drew between respectable information and folk wisdom, between book learning and observation, between the knowledge of educated men and the knowledge of people who had simply paid attention to what worked. Her mother had taught her that wisdom did not care about its origins, only about its accuracy, and now she was putting that teaching to the test. The afternoon after Gunnar's visit, Sigrid stood on the hillside with Torsten and looked at what they were about to do. The sky was gray, the wind was cold, the ground was hard but not yet frozen. They had perhaps 3 weeks before winter made excavation impossible. 3 weeks to dig a hole in a hillside. 3 weeks to line it with sod. 3 weeks to install timbers and build a chimney and create something that would shelter them through 5 months of Nebraska winter. 3 weeks to build something that would keep them alive. Torsten looked at his sister, at the stakes in the ground, at the hillside rising behind them. "Do you really think this will work?" His voice was not doubtful, not challenging, simply asking, the way you ask someone you trust about something you do not yet understand. Sigrid looked at the hillside, at the angle of the slope, at the way the morning sun hit the south-facing surface, at the grass growing thicker there than anywhere else on her section because the soil held more warmth and more moisture. She thought about her mother's root cellar, about the way it held 52 degrees in January and 52 degrees in July, about the vegetables that kept there all winter while the ones in the barn froze solid. She thought about the Lakota earth lodges, about the French-Canadians' dugout on the Platte, about the mining manual and its precise descriptions of thermal behavior underground. And she thought about Gunnar Holberg's prediction, 2 orphan children digging their own graves. "Yes," her voice was quiet. "Certain. I really think this will work." Fenrir came to stand beside her, his shoulder pressed against her leg. His eyes scanned the horizon the way they always did, looking for threats that human eyes could not see. She reached down and rested her hand on his head. The 3 of them stood there for a moment. A 17-year-old girl, a 15-year-old boy, a gray dog with wolf blood in his veins, looking at a hillside that most people would have dismissed as useless, seeing in it the shape of something that might save their lives. The earth has a memory longer than men. Her mother had said that on a spring day in Minnesota, standing at the edge of a south-facing garden, looking at the soil that was already warming while the north-facing beds remained frozen. The earth has a memory longer than men. And sometimes the young remember what the old have forgotten. Tomorrow the work would begin. The Peterson brothers would arrive with their strong backs and their skepticism. The sod would be cut and stacked. The timbers would be placed. The chimney would be lined with clay, according to her mother's formula. And 47 days later, in the night of December 29th, 1876, when the temperature outside dropped to 45 degrees below zero, Sigrid Lindqvist would be reading a book in a room that held at 53 degrees, while Gunnar Holberg burned his furniture, while 2 people died 47 feet from their front door, while an 11-month-old baby froze in a house that could not keep the cold out. She would be warm, because she had listened to her mother, because she had paid attention to what actually worked, because she had been willing to dig a hole in the ground and live in it while everyone around her told her she was digging her own grave. Sigrid stood on that hillside in November of 1876, 17 years old, with $250 and a plan, a brother who believed in her, and a beau who would never leave her side. The wind picked up cold and sharp, carrying the smell of winter coming. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She had work to do, and she was ready to begin. The Peterson brothers arrived on the second day. Niels was 19 years old. Arvid was 17. They were referred by their father, who had more sons than he had work for, and who was glad to send 2 of them out for wages that would help feed the rest. 50 cents a day, cash money. They thought the project was somewhere between eccentric and doomed. But the silver coins were real and the work was straightforward. So they came. Niels was the older one, taller, broader in the shoulders. He had a way of looking at things that suggested he was forming opinions he might or might not share, depending on how the conversation went. Arvid was quieter, leaner, built for endurance rather than power. He did what his brother told him to do and saved his questions for later. They stood at the edge of the excavation site on that first morning and looked at the stakes in the ground and at the girl who had placed them. Niels crossed his arms, You want us to dig into the hill? His voice was neutral, neither hostile nor friendly. The voice of a man who wanted to understand what he was being asked to do before he committed to doing it. Sigrid nodded. 8 feet back, 3 feet down from the surface grade, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep. Nils looked at the hillside, at the angle of the slope, at the stakes marking the dimensions. That is a lot of dirt. Yes. And then what? Then we build walls, cut sod bricks, stack them 2 courses deep with dead air between. Install roof timbers, line a chimney with clay. Niels was quiet for a moment. Arvid shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Fenrir sat at Sigurd's side watching the brothers with calm attention. His ears were forward. His eyes tracked their movements. But his body was relaxed. He had decided they were not threats, just strangers who had not yet proven themselves. You have done this before, Niels asked. No, his eyebrows rose slightly. But you know how. Yes. How? Because I have been paying attention. Niels considered this. He looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them that required no words. Then he turned back to Sigrid. 50 cents a day. 50 cents a day. Cash money. Cash money. He nodded once. Then I guess we start digging. They started digging. The work was hard in the particular way that work is hard when you are moving earth by hand with tools that have not changed in 1,000 years. Pick, shovel, wheelbarrow. Arms that burned, backs that ached, hands that blistered and bled and blistered again. The first 3 days were pure excavation. 8 feet back into the hillside, 3 feet down from the surface grade, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, 9 feet of headroom at the front tapering to 6 feet at the back where the ceiling would meet the hillside. The dimensions were specific and deliberate. Sigrid had calculated each one based on what she had read and what she had observed and what her mother had taught her about the behavior of earth and heat and air. Nothing was arbitrary, nothing was left to chance. Torsten worked alongside the Peterson brothers. He was smaller than they were, younger, less experienced with physical labor. But he did not complain. He did not ask for rest when they did not ask for rest. He moved dirt and carried tools and learned by watching and kept his mouth shut unless he had something useful to say. Fenrir kept watch. He had appointed himself guardian of the construction site. Each day he spent patrolling the perimeter, occasionally chasing rabbits, mostly watching. At night he slept beside Sigrid in the tent they had pitched near the excavation. His warmth was a comfort she did not acknowledge, but deeply appreciated. By the end of the 5th day, the excavation was complete. A hole in the earth, 8 feet deep into the hillside, 3 feet below the surface grade, ready to become something more than a hole. The sod cutting began on day 6. Nebraska sod was unlike any other building material Sigrid had encountered in descriptions or in practice. The root systems of decades of bluestem and buffalo grass had woven through the topsoil and bound it together into something that was more like compressed fiber than loose dirt. Dense, cohesive. When cut to the right dimensions and allowed to dry briefly, it was as structurally useful as a brick of modest quality. And it cost nothing but labor. Sigrid marked the dimensions on the prairie grass, 36 inches long, 12 inches wide, 6 inches thick, 45 pounds per brick when freshly cut. She and the Peterson brothers worked in a rhythm that developed over the first few hours and refined itself over the first few days. Cut, lift, stack, move to the next section, repeat. 247 bricks. That was the number Sigrid had calculated. 247 sod bricks to build the walls that would keep her and her brother alive through the winter. By the end of day 6, they had cut 83. By the end of day 7, 161. By the end of day 8, 247, plus 12 extra, just in case. Nils stood at the edge of the brick field on that 8th evening, looking at the rows of sod rectangles drying in the November air. His forearms were so fatigued he could barely close his hands around the shovel handle. Arvid had developed blisters that burst and reformed twice over. Sigrid's hands were in the same condition. She wrapped them each evening in cloth torn from a spare shirt, unwrapped them each morning without mentioning it, and kept working. Torsten's hands were worse. He was younger. His skin was softer, but he said nothing, just wrapped them the way his sister did. and kept working. That is a lot of bricks, Neil said. His voice was different now than it had been on the first day. Less skeptical, more curious. Yes, Sigrid agreed. What are they for? She told him. The sod bricks would form the front wall, 28 inches thick at the base, tapering to 20 inches at the top. This was the load-bearing exterior face of the structure. 2 feet behind it, an interior wall, 12 inches of sod running parallel, enclosing a dead airspace that would prove in the months ahead to be worth more than any other element of the design. Why 2 walls? Because air that cannot move conducts heat extremely poorly. Sigrid looked at the bricks, at the excavation behind her, at the hillside rising above. 2 feet of still-trapped air is worth more than 4 feet of solid earth in terms of resisting heat transfer. Niels considered this. His eyes moved from the bricks to the excavation to Sigrid's face. Who taught you that? No one. Then how do you know it? Because I watched, and I read, and I thought about what I was seeing and reading until it made sense. Niels was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, and something changed in the way he looked at her. Not the skepticism of the first day, not the neutral assessment of a man doing a job for wages. Something closer to respect. The wall construction began on day 9. The sod bricks formed the front wall first, 28 inches thick at the base, tapering to 20 inches at the top. Each brick placed with care, each joint staggered from the course below. The technique was simple. The execution was exhausting. 45 pounds per brick, 247 bricks, lifted and placed and adjusted and checked for level. By the end of day 9, the exterior wall was 3 courses high. By the end of day 10, 6 courses. By the end of day 11, the exterior wall was complete, rising from the excavation floor to meet the hillside above. A solid face of Nebraska sod, 28 inches of earth and roots and grass, standing between the interior space and whatever the weather chose to throw at it. The interior wall went up faster, only 12 inches thick, positioned 2 feet inside the exterior wall, creating the dead airspace that Sigrid had calculated. The space at floor level was sealed with packed clay. The space at the top was vented in a controlled way that Sigrid had worked out from the mineshaft chapter of the engineering manual, allowing moisture-laden air to escape through the eaves, without creating a thermal bridge. By the end of day 12, both walls were complete, and then the timber cracked. The sound was not loud, a dry, splitting report that would not have been audible 20 feet away. But Sigrid heard it, and she knew immediately what it meant. She crossed the space in 4 steps, found the fault, a stress fracture running 8 inches along the grain, beginning 6 inches from the end. The 6 lodgepole pine timber, one of the support beams that would carry 3 tons of earth above their heads. It had not separated fully, but it would under load. The timber was unusable. Sigrid had ordered 1 spare, just 1, because that was all she could afford. Niels and Arvid set down their tools and watched her examine the spare timber. Their faces carried what she recognized without looking at them as apprehension. If the spare was flawed, the project stopped. There was no more money for additional timbers. No time to reorder before winter closed the supply routes. No alternative structural solution that she had prepared for. Sigrid took the spare timber from its position against the hillside. She went over it methodically, inch by inch, pressing her thumbnail into the grain at intervals to test for soft spots, sighting down its length for any deviation in straightness, checking both end cuts for evidence of hidden cracks. Fenrir watched from his position near the tent. His ears were forward. His body was still. He knew something was wrong. He always knew. The spare timber was sound, no cracks, no soft spots, no hidden flaws. It would hold. Sigrid said nothing about this to Niels or Arvid beyond instructing them on the placement. But that evening, walking back to the tent with Torsten and Fenrir, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. The margin she was working within was narrower than she preferred. 1 timber, 1 spare. Enough money for neither mistake nor contingency. Whatever she built had to be right the first time. We cannot afford to be wrong. She said it quietly. Not a complaint, just a statement of fact. Torsten nodded. He had figured that out already. Then what we will do is not be wrong. Fenrir pressed against her leg as they walked. His warmth was steady and reassuring in the November cold. They kept going. Heinrich Brenner came by on the afternoon of day 14. He was a mason, trained for 4 years in Philadelphia in the craft of laying stone, calculating load, managing the behavior of materials under stress. He had built his family a stone house that was, by any objective measure, the finest structure within 20 miles. It had cost him 8 months of work and considerable money, and he was proud of it, the way a craftsman is proud of something that demonstrates his skill to anyone with eyes to see. He walked around the perimeter of the excavation, said nothing for several minutes, looked at the double wall system, at the timber placement, at the angle of the chimney running through the hillside. Then he raised the moisture concern. Underground spaces accumulate moisture. His voice was measured, professional, the voice of a man who had seen problems that other men had not anticipated. Moisture produces mold. Mold produces lung disease. He paused. His face shifted. Something darker passed through his eyes. I had a cousin in Pennsylvania who tried something similar. His wife died of consumption within 2 years. Sigrid did not argue with the moisture concern, because it was a real concern. Instead, she asked him a question. Have you ever touched the interior walls of a properly built root cellar in February and found them damp? Heinrich stopped. She told him that she had done exactly that, every winter of her childhood. And the difference between a root cellar that stayed dry and one that accumulated moisture was drainage and ventilation. The floor had to direct water away from the living area. The structure had to exchange air daily in a controlled way that allowed moisture to leave without allowing heat to escape. She described the door gap system she planned to use: 1 inch of opening during daylight hours, sealed at night, and the chimney arrangement that would create continuous gentle air movement through the space even when the door was closed. Heinrich looked at her, the way a man looks at someone who has just used a professional's logic to answer a professional's question, without having the professional's credentials, a complicated mixture of acknowledgement and resistance. You are young, his voice was not unkind, and understanding the theory and executing the practice are not the same thing. He paused, his voice softened slightly. Come to my house when you get cold enough. There will be space by the stove. Then he left, and Sigrid went back to work. Reverend Josiah Whitfield arrived on the 15th day. He came on foot, which was unusual. He stood at the edge of the work area with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man delivering a prepared statement. Whitfield was 52 years old, from Boston originally, educated at a respectable institution, possessed of the particular conviction common to men of his background and era who had chosen to come west. That civilization was something you brought with you rather than something you built from available materials. He had constructed a white-painted frame house that looked in isolation on the Nebraska prairie like something that had been transported from a Massachusetts village green without its surroundings. And he held this as evidence of standards maintained rather than impracticality demonstrated. He said what he had come to say, methodically. A young woman living alone in an underground structure was not appropriate. It would create an impression in the community that would follow her. There were better options available: domestic placement with an established family, a position of useful employment, the possibility of a suitable marriage arrangement in time. The church community was prepared to help her find a proper situation. Sigrid listened to this fully before she said anything. Niels and Arvid had stopped working. They stood with their tools in their hands, watching. Torsten stood near the entrance to the excavation. His face was carefully blank, but his hands were clenched at his sides. Fenrir had risen to his feet. His ears were forward. His body was still in the particular way that preceded movement. Sigrid told Whitfield that she had filed a homestead claim and intended to prove it up. His expression shifted. The Homestead Act was written for families, for men with resources, not for your situation. His voice carried the patient condescension of a man explaining something obvious to someone too young to understand it. Nature does not care about legal technicalities. You will be gone by spring and someone more suitable will work this land. It was in the worst part of that sentence that she heard it. He was not concerned about her propriety in the abstract. He was managing a circumstance on behalf of someone who had a stake in its resolution. Silas Harmon has spoken to you. Sigrid said it flatly, not a question, a statement. Whitfield's hands shifted behind his back. He said that her stepfather was naturally concerned about her welfare. Sigrid felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, something harder than fear. The widower in Fort Hartshorn, Cornelius Pruitt, he is my stepfather's business associate. This was not something Whitfield had told her, but she had reasoned it out from the particulars. A 48-year-old man with decent land, identified and arranged as a marriage prospect within weeks of her mother's death, at a time when Silas Harmon was also consolidating his claim. Looking at adjacent land parcels, making calculations about property and inheritance and the legal complications of stepchildren. The concern is about the land, not about me. Whitfield did not confirm this, but he did not deny it with the speed or conviction of a man denying something false. His silence was a form of answer, and it told her something she had half understood before, but now understood completely. She had not simply escaped an uncomfortable domestic situation. She had disrupted a financial arrangement that involved her as a variable rather than a person. The discomfort she had caused was not merely social, it was economic. She thanked Whitfield for his visit and went back to work. He left, and she was aware in a way she had not quite been before that the stakes of what she was doing extended beyond her own survival. If she failed, she would be absorbed back into someone else's plan. If she succeeded, she would have demonstrated something that no one in the area had seen demonstrated before, that the arrangement could be refused, and survived. The 19th day arrived, and the structure was complete. Sigrid and Torsten and the Peterson brothers stood back from it and looked at what they had made. From the outside, it was almost invisible. A low mound of earth with a door set into the hillside and a thin thread of smoke emerging from a chimney pipe you had to know to look for. It looked like not much. It looked like a place that offered nothing particular against the weather. From the inside, the proportions were different, and Sigrid had not anticipated how the earth walls would make the space feel. Not cramped, but enclosed in a way that carried warmth in it. The way a hand cupped around a small flame makes the flame seem larger without adding any fuel. 192 square feet, a rope bed in one corner with a straw mattress, a small table and 2 chairs that Niels had built from scrap lumber on the last afternoon, which she had not asked for, and which told her something about Niels that she had not known before. Shelves cut directly into the back wall, the earth firm enough to hold them without framing. The stove in its corner, radiating a heat that felt in contrast to the blunt assault of a wood stove burning at capacity, more like the warmth of something living. Niels stood in the doorway, looking around with an expression she could not quite read. "I thought this was foolish." His voice was quiet. "When we started, I thought we were helping you waste your money on something that would kill you." He paused. "I do not think that anymore." Arvid nodded. He was a boy of fewer words than his brother, but his agreement was clear. They left that evening with their wages and something else, something harder to name, the experience of having built something that might matter. Sigrid would see them again, but that is a part of the story that comes later. Edmund Holloway came that same afternoon. He was 34 years old, a school teacher from Wisconsin who had taken a homestead claim to supplement his teaching salary. Unlike most of his neighbors, he had studied natural philosophy at college in a way that left him interested in how things actually worked, rather than simply in whether they conformed to established practice. He arrived on foot with a notebook under his arm. He walked around the exterior of the dugout twice without saying anything. Then he went inside and walked around the interior twice without saying anything. Then he came back outside and stood in the late November light, looking at the chimney outlet. "You are using thermal mass." His voice carried a different quality than any voice Sigrid had heard since she began this project. Not skepticism, not condescension, not concern. Curiosity. The genuine curiosity of someone trying to understand what they were seeing. Sigrid said she did not know what that meant. He explained it, in the language of someone accustomed to translating between formal knowledge and practical application. The earth surrounding the dugout was a heat reservoir. At a depth of 6 feet in December, the ground temperature in this part of Nebraska territory held at approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit. It would hold at approximately 52 degrees in July as well. The earth did not change temperature rapidly because it had enormous mass, and mass resisted thermal change in proportion to its quantity. The dugout was surrounded on 3 sides and above by a battery that held at 52 degrees year-round. In winter, she only needed to add a small amount of heat to bring the interior from 52 to a comfortable temperature. In summer, she needed only to allow the Earth to absorb the small excess of solar and occupant heat to keep it cool. Meanwhile, every other structure in the area was essentially a wooden box with a fire inside it, losing heat in all directions simultaneously, fighting the temperature differential between inside and outside with nothing but the combustion rate of its fuel supply. Edmund looked at her with something that held an entirely different quality than the appraisal she had received from Gunnar and Heinrich and Whitfield. Not the assessment of someone deciding whether to dismiss her. The focused attention of someone genuinely trying to understand what they were encountering. Who taught you this? Sigrid considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. No one. She looked at the dugout, at the chimney, at the door set into the hillside. Root vegetables stay the same temperature all winter in a properly built cellar. I thought that if vegetables could manage it, I probably could too. Edmund almost smiled. He said there was a physicist named Hermann von Helmholtz who had been writing about energy conservation and thermodynamic principles, and that what she had built was a practical demonstration of those principles, executed by someone who had arrived at them from observation rather than from theory. He said it was from an engineering standpoint genuinely impressive. She asked whether it would keep them alive. He said that if she managed moisture and maintained the ventilation gap, yes, it should work excellently. He paused. He said there were still risks. A blocked chimney could produce carbon monoxide before she recognized the problem. A drainage failure in heavy rain or snowmelt could turn the floor into a swamp faster than she could address it. If the roof timbers had any hidden flaws, the failure would be sudden and complete. And she was 3 miles from the nearest neighbor who would notice if she stopped emerging. Sigrid said she would be careful. He said that being careful was a strategy and not a guarantee, and that the natural world did not make exceptions for good intentions. He said he hoped she made it. He said that if she did, she would have proven something worth proving. Then he left, and Sigrid went inside, lit the stove, and watched the temperature climb. Torsten was already at his desk, recording the first official temperature reading in his composition book. Fenrir had found the warmest spot near the stove, but not too close. He turned 3 times, lay down, and released a long, contented sigh. He approved. They moved in on the 4th of December, a Monday, gray and windless, the sky pressing flat against the prairie like a hand holding something down. The temperature outside was 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the dugout, before she lit the stove for the first time, the thermometer she hung on a nail near the interior wall read 51 degrees. Sigrid stood in the middle of the space for a moment after setting down her trunk and the sack of provisions she had carried from the tent, taking inventory, not of her supplies, but of the structure itself, checking it with the specific attention of someone who has built a thing and now needed to determine whether the thing had been built correctly. The walls were solid, the floor was dry, the air smelled of earth, cool and mineral, and faintly sweet, in the way that disturbed ground often smells in the weeks after it has been cut and resettled. Torsten was already arranging his things in his corner, his composition book, his pen and ink, the small collection of books he had managed to bring. Fenrir had completed his inspection of every corner, and was now settled in his spot near the stove, watching them with patient eyes. Sigrid lit the stove with a handful of dry grass and 2 small splits of cottonwood, and watched the temperature on the thermometer begin its slow, steady climb. By evening, it read 63 degrees. She had used approximately 3 pounds of wood. The structure was working. The first real test came on the 15th of December, 3 weeks after they moved in. The cold snap arrived from the northwest without particular announcement. A pressure drop that Edmund Holloway could have described in terms of Arctic air mass movement and temperature gradient mechanics, which Sigrid understood simply as the sky changing its mind about how cold it intended to be. By evening, the thermometer outside read -6 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, it was -18. It held there for 3 consecutive nights, the kind of sustained cold that separated the structures that had been built with adequate thermal mass from the structures that had been built with adequate optimism. Each morning, Sigrid woke to a dugout that read 58 degrees without any fire having burned since the previous evening. She would add wood, a single large split of cottonwood. 2 of the denser hedge apple pieces she had sourced from a windbreak someone had cleared the previous fall, and within 45 minutes the temperature rose to 65. She used 6 pounds of wood per day during the cold snap, which was within her projected range, which meant her wood supply of 3/4 of a cord would last comfortably through March, even if the winter ran long. Torsten tracked every number. His composition book was filling with data that would become in time evidence that could not be argued with. Fenrir seemed oblivious to the cold. As long as the dugout stayed warm and his people stayed close, he was content. Ezra Tate came on the 26th of December. He was 60 years old, a fur trader, 25 years operating in Nebraska territory. The kind of man whose knowledge of the land was less academic than atmospheric. Absorbed through 2.5 decades of reading weather patterns the way other men read books. He arrived on a mule, moving slowly, his eyes scanning the sky even as he approached. Fenrir rose to his feet and watched him come. Not aggressive, respectful. One creature who understood the prairie, recognizing another. Ezra dismounted and stood for a moment looking at the dugout, at the chimney outlet, at the door set into the hillside. Then he looked at Sigrid. There is a storm coming. His voice was flat, factual. The voice of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the weather, but who had never stopped being concerned about it. Not a cold snap, a storm. He described what he had been reading in the sky and the wind patterns for the past 4 days. With the precision of someone translating one language into another, the atmospheric language he had been fluent in for 2 decades, translated into terms that a 17-year-old homesteader could act on. The pressure had been dropping in a specific way, a way he associated with the worst storms he had seen in his years on the territory. The kind that came from far enough north that they carried a cold so deep it was more like a physical substance than a temperature. Something that got into structures through gaps you had not known existed, and reduced a man's options to a narrow set of increasingly bad choices. He told her she needed to leave. Not in the morning, not after she had thought about it. Now, today, while the roads were still passable, there were families in the settlement who would take her and her brother in. Sigrid looked at her wood supply, her food stores, her water barrels. She looked at Torsten, who was standing in the doorway listening. She looked at Fenrir, who had come to stand beside her, pressing against her leg. She thought about the calculations she had run when she was planning the structure, the worst-case scenarios she had built into the design margins. The difference between a structure that performed at expected values and a structure that had margin left over when the expected values proved insufficient. She thanked him and told him she was staying. Ezra did not argue with her, not the way people who have not thought about a decision argue with people who have. He looked at the dugout with the assessing eye of someone who had looked at a great many structures in his years on the territory and had formed opinions about which ones were going to stand and which ones were going to fail. Whatever he saw in the low mound of earth with its invisible chimney and its heavy cottonwood door, it did not produce in him the expression of a man who had already decided she was wrong. It produced something more complicated than that, closer to a man who was genuinely uncertain about the outcome, and who found the uncertainty unusual. 2 people are going to die in this storm. His voice was quiet. In this area. That is not a guess. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a coil of heavy rope, 1/2-inch hemp. He handed it to her. The explanation was unnecessary. If she had to leave the dugout during whiteout conditions, she needed something connecting her to the doorframe, because 20 feet in a Nebraska blizzard could be the last walk a person ever took. Sigrid took the rope. Torsten stepped forward and took one end, examining the weave with the serious attention he gave to all practical matters. Ezra looked at them both, at the dugout behind them, at Fenrir standing guard. Your confidence makes me more anxious rather than less. His eyes held something that might have been concern, or might have been respect, or might have been both. Not because I doubt your preparation, but because I have spent 25 years watching prepared people die from the one thing they had not prepared for. And the one thing is always different. Sigrid met his gaze. I am not confident that I have thought of everything. I am confident that if I have not, being somewhere else would not help me. Ezra was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coil of rope beside the door, at the wood supply, at the water barrels, at the carefully organized provisions. He looked at Torsten's composition book open on the table to the current week's entries. Numbers and columns, consistent and precise. He looked at Fenrir lying near the stove, watching with ancient eyes. I have been through this territory for 25 years. His voice was different now, softer. I have never seen a homestead this well prepared in its first season. He paused. I hope it is enough. Then he mounted his mule and rode south, and Sigurd went inside, tied one end of the rope to the doorframe, coiled the rest neatly beside the entrance. Fenrir sniffed the rope, then settled down beside it, understanding in his own way that something important was coming. On the 28th of December, she took inventory. She did it standing in the middle of the dugout, going through each category of supply aloud, not because she needed to hear herself to remember, but because speaking the numbers gave them a weight that the mental list did not carry. 38 pounds of cornmeal, 45 pounds of salt pork, 30 pounds of dried beans, 14 pounds of rice, 6 pounds of coffee, 4 gallons of kerosene, 60 pounds of winter squash stored in the small cellar hole she had dug into the hillside behind the main structure, 4 chickens in the attached coop. They had been laying through the cold snap, producing 2 eggs a day between them. Because she had kept the coop temperature above freezing by running the chimney pipe through the outer wall of it before it turned upward, a piece of design she had added in November, which was paying dividends she had not fully anticipated. 20 gallons of water in sealed barrels. 3/4 of a cord of wood stacked inside the entrance tunnel. She was ready, more than ready. Torsten had his own list: food, water, fuel, reading material. He had been systematic about it. Fenrir had been fed and watered. He watched them inventory with calm eyes. Whatever was coming, he would face it with them. That afternoon, Ezra Tate came back, making good on his word to give her one final warning before the storm arrived. He stood in the doorway and looked at her inventory, at her face, reading the second more carefully than the first. He said again that people were going to die in this storm, and he wanted to make sure she understood that the risk was genuine rather than dramatic. She said she knew 2 people were going to die. She said she knew she was not going to be one of them. He considered this for a long moment. Then he said that her certainty made him more anxious rather than less, not because he doubted her preparation, but because he had spent 25 years watching prepared people die from the one thing they had not prepared for. And the one thing was always different. He said that overconfidence was more dangerous than the storm itself, because the storm arrived from outside and you could see it coming, while overconfidence lived inside and tended to stay quiet until the moment it became fatal. Sigrid said she was not confident that she had thought of everything. She was confident that if she had not, being somewhere else would not help her. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coil of rope beside the door, at the wood supply, at the water barrels, at the carefully organized provisions. He looked at Torsten's composition book open on the table. Numbers and columns, consistent and precise. He looked at Fenrir lying near the stove, watching with ancient eyes. I hope you are right. His voice was soft. I hope you have built what you think you have built. He mounted his mule and rode away. And Sigrid closed the door. And they were alone. A 17-year-old girl, a 15-year-old boy, and a gray dog with wolf blood in his veins, waiting for the storm. The storm came at 2 in the morning on the 29th of December, and it did not arrive gradually. There was no period of increasing wind, no sequence of warning gusts that would have allowed a person to track the progression. One moment the night was cold and still, and then something massive and deliberate changed its mind about where it was going. The sound that followed was not wind in the conventional sense, not the familiar whistle of air moving through gaps and around corners. It was something beneath sound, a pressure change felt in the chest before the ears processed it, the sensation of the atmosphere itself reorganizing its weight. Fenrir was on his feet instantly, his ears rigid, a low growl building in his throat, not at an intruder, at the world itself. The dugout shuddered, not violently, not in a way that suggested structural failure, but in the specific way that a very large, very solid thing acknowledges the presence of a force that deserves acknowledgement. Dust filtered down from between the sod layers in the ceiling, fine particles, no more than the surface dust that accumulated in any earth structure. But the movement of them told Sigrid that the pressure differential above her was significant. Torsten sat up in his bed, eyes wide in the darkness. Sigrid lit the lamp and checked the thermometer. 54 degrees. It had dropped from 57 over the previous 4 hours, a rate of thermal transfer that the structure was handling. but that was faster than she had seen in any previous cold event. She added wood to the stove, a larger piece than her usual evening addition, and watched the temperature respond, climbing back through 56, 58, settling at 61. Outside, the thermometer she had placed near the ventilation gap had stopped moving hours ago, frozen at a number that belonged in a nightmare rather than reality. 31 degrees below zero, and still falling. Sigrid sat at the small table with the lamp burning and recorded the numbers. Torsten did the same in his composition book. His hand was steady, even if his face was pale. Fenrir had settled again, but his ears remained alert, rotating towards sounds that human ears could not detect. She thought about the dead airspace between the walls, currently holding 52 degrees regardless of what was happening on either side of it. She thought about the 6 lodge-pole pine timbers above her head, carrying 3 tons of earth, absorbing the dynamic load of the wind pressing against the hillside above them. She thought about the spare timber she had used on the 12th day of construction, the one she had gone over inch by inch before trusting it, and she was glad she had been that careful. She did not sleep that night. Neither did Torsten. They sat together at the small table, taking turns adding wood to the stove, watching the thermometer, listening to the sound of a force that wanted to kill them and could not reach them. Fenrir stayed awake too, a gray guardian in the amber lamplight. The second day of the blizzard was the hardest, and it was hard in a way she had not prepared for, because what it asked of her was not physical. By midday on the 29th, the temperature outside had reached 38 degrees below zero, and the wind was producing a ground blizzard that reduced visibility to zero at ground level. While the sky above the storm layer remained technically clear, a feature of severe prairie blizzards that was particularly dangerous because it deceived people into thinking the storm was less extreme than it was. Sigrid knew this from the engineering manual. From conversations with Ezra Tate, she had no intention of opening her door. The rope tied to the door frame was for emergencies only, and this was not an emergency. This was a situation she had prepared for and was managing. What she had not prepared for was the sound she heard at approximately 2 in the afternoon. It was distant, attenuated by the earth walls and the wind noise, and she could not have said with certainty what it was. It might have been an animal. It might have been a particular combination of wind and terrain that produced something resembling a human sound. But it moved through her in a way that animal sounds and weather sounds did not. A frequency that the body responds to before the mind has processed it. And she sat very still at her table with her pen in her hand and listened. Torsten heard it too. She could see it in his face, in the way his writing stopped, in the way his eyes moved to the door and stayed there. Fenrir was on his feet, whining softly. His nose pointed toward the door. The temperature held at 60 degrees, and she could not do anything. This was the part that the design could not address. She had solved the problem of staying alive in a Nebraska winter with $200 and 19 days of labor. She had not solved the problem of being inside a place that could keep her alive while someone outside might be dying. And the gap between those two things was not a technical problem. It was the specific weight of being safe when safety was not general. Outside was 45 degrees below zero. Visibility was zero. If she opened that door, she would not find whoever had made that sound. She would become another body for someone else to find in the spring. And Torsten would be alone. She picked up her pen and wrote down the temperature and the time and the wood consumption figure for the morning. She wrote them in her small, precise handwriting in the columns she had established for them. She made the numbers as accurate as she could make them, because accuracy was the only thing available to her right now. And she needed to do something that was real. The wind did not stop. It ran through the rest of the afternoon, through the night, into the morning of the 30th, dropping below minus 40 degrees at some point in the early morning hours. Sigrid tended the stove with the small, deliberate movements of someone who had no attention to waste, keeping the interior between 58 and 63 degrees, checking the ventilation gap every 2 hours to ensure it had not frozen shut, confirming that the drainage at the base of the entrance tunnel was not accumulating ice that could seal the door from outside. Torsten helped. He was steady. He was reliable. He was becoming someone she could depend on completely. Fenrir slept in shifts, one ear always cocked toward the door, the other toward his people. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check temperatures and add wood, moving through the tasks with the efficiency of someone who has done them enough times that the sequence has become automatic. The structure performed. Every element she had calculated and built and tested and modified and worried over performed within its predicted range. And the earth that surrounded her on three sides and overhead held its temperature and held its position and did not shift or crack or fail. At 4 in the morning on December 30th, the wind stopped. It did not taper. It stopped completely. The way very large things sometimes end, not with diminishment, but with a sudden absence that was almost more alarming than the presence had been. Fenrir was the first to react. He lifted his head, ears rotating, then his tail began to wag, slowly at first. Then with increasing certainty, he knew before she did. Sigrid sat up in bed and listened to the silence for a full minute before she was certain of it. Then she checked the thermometer. Inside 56 degrees, outside 45 degrees below zero. She built the fire up slowly, letting the temperature climb to 64. And then she sat at the table and drank coffee and waited for the light. Torsten joined her. They sat in silence, drinking coffee, watching the lamp flame steady in the still air. When she opened the door in the early morning gray, the snow had drifted 8 to 10 feet against the exterior face of the hillside. She found the rope attached to the doorframe and used it to keep her orientation while she worked with the short-handled shovel she kept inside the entrance, carving a path through the drift one armful at a time. The air was so cold it did not feel like air. It felt like a material, something with substance and intention, pressing against her face and the exposed backs of her hands with a directness that made every second outside a transaction she was paying for with warmth she had built up over hours of careful tending. Fenrir pushed past her, leaping into the snow, disappearing and reappearing as he tested the frozen landscape. His wolf blood served him here. He was built for this. She carved enough of a path to see over the drift line. And then she stopped. To the northwest in the direction of Gunnar Holberg's property, there was smoke in the sky. Not the thin, pale thread of a chimney drawing cleanly, not the column of heavy gray smoke from a house fire. Something between those two. Thick, dark in color. The specific smoke of furniture burning. Of wood that had been treated and painted and shaped for domestic use being consumed because it was the last fuel available. Sigrid went back inside. She added the biggest log in her supply to the stove. Then she picked up a second log and wrapped it in canvas against her chest. She picked up the short shovel. She looked at the thermometer one more time. 64 degrees inside. Outside, the cold had become something beyond numbers. Something that existed in a category all its own. Torsten was already on his feet. "Stay here." Her voice was calm. "Keep the fire going. I will be back." Fenrir stood at the door, refusing to be left behind. She looked at the dumb, at his gray fur, his wolf eyes, his absolute loyalty. "All right, we go together." She went back out into the cold and started walking. The walk to Gunnar Holberg's property took 40 minutes in conditions that should have made it impossible. The snow had drifted in the specific way of blizzard aftermath, not evenly, but in ridges and valleys that bore no relationship to the terrain beneath them, so that a flat stretch of ground had become a landscape of its own. The drifts rising to her chest in some places, falling away to knee-deep in others. With no pattern she could read in advance, she moved through them with the short shovel, not clearing a path, but using the blade as a probe, testing the surface ahead of her before committing her weight. The same methodical caution she applied to every problem that presented itself without obvious solution. Fenrir ran ahead, finding the easier routes, circling back to show her the way. His wolf heritage served him well here. He was built for this kind of cold, for this kind of challenge. The canvas-wrapped log against her chest lost heat steadily as she walked. She could feel the warmth diminishing as she went, which was information she used to pace herself, moving faster when the drift conditions allowed, accepting the cold as a fact rather than fighting it as an enemy. The Holberg house came into view after 30 minutes. A timber frame structure on flat ground with no natural windbreak, which meant the blizzard had hit it with its full force for 36 hours. The evidence was visible from 200 yards. The north-facing boards had been partially stripped by the wind. 3 courses of siding peeled back to expose the sheathing beneath, and the sheathing itself was dark with absorbed moisture, that had frozen in the gaps between boards and expanded them. A window on the east side had cracked. The chimney was producing smoke, but it was the dark, slow smoke of a fire-burning material that was not designed to be burned. The combustion products of paint and varnish and whatever wood treatment the furniture had received, heavy in the air above the house. Sigrid reached the door, knocked once, then pushed it open without waiting. Because if there was anyone inside in a condition that required privacy, the cold outside would quickly become a more pressing concern than privacy. The interior temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Gunnar Holberg was standing at the stove in the center of the main room, an axe in his hands, the legs of what had been a dining table stacked beside him. He was wearing his coat indoors. His breath was visible. Fenrir moved past Sigrid and went straight to the corner where Gunnar's wife Ingrid sat with their two children. A boy of about 10, a girl of perhaps 7, pressed against their mother in the specific configuration of people who have determined that shared body heat is a survival strategy rather than a comfort. The dog lay down beside the children, offering his warmth. The girl reached out and buried her fingers in his fur. Those fingers, the ones visible beneath the makeshift bandages Ingrid had fashioned from torn bedsheets. They had the waxy pallor of tissue too long deprived of warmth. The boy's face was the white and red of someone who had been very cold for a long time and whose body was working extremely hard to maintain its core temperature. Gunnar turned when she came through the door, and his face went through several things in rapid sequence. Recognition, something that was not quite shame but lived in the same neighborhood. Then the practical focus of a man whose family was cold and who had just been handed a means of addressing that fact. Sigrid crossed the room and set the canvas-wrapped log down beside the stove. It was still warm at the center. Gunnar took it without speaking, opened the stove door, placed it carefully on the coals, adjusted the damper with the knowledge of someone who had been managing a fire through a crisis and understood how close he was to losing the battle. Ingrid Holberg stood up from the corner, crossed the room, took both of Sigrid's hands in her own, and held them. She was a woman in her late 30s, fair-haired and practical, not among those who had come by with bread and opinions about the impropriety of a young woman living underground. She had not said anything publicly either way, which Sigrid had noted and respected. Now she looked at the girl who had walked 40 minutes through impossible cold carrying a log wrapped in canvas, accompanied by a gray dog who was currently keeping her children warm. Thank you, just those 2 words, steady, with the weight of someone who understands that the words are inadequate to what they are trying to carry, and says them anyway because they are all that is available. Gunnar had his back to the room, adjusting the stove. His shoulders were not entirely still. Sigrid stayed for 2 hours, long enough to confirm that the wood had caught and the stove was stabilizing and the room temperature was rising above the threshold where it could do permanent damage to the children. The boy's color improved within 40 minutes. The girl's hands concerned her more. 2 of the fingers had the specific pallor and insensitivity of tissue that had been below adequate temperature for longer than was medically acceptable. Sigrid said so plainly. She said the girl needed to be seen by a physician. The nearest one was in Fort Hartshorn. The roads would be passable within 2 days if the temperature came up. In the meantime, the hands needed to be warmed slowly rather than quickly. The worst response was what people instinctively wanted to do: apply direct heat as fast as possible. She described the process carefully: the temperature of the water, the duration, the signs to watch for. Ingrid listened with the focused attention of a woman filing away information she intended to use correctly. Fenrir stayed with the children the entire time, letting them pet him, providing what comfort an animal could provide. Before she left, Gunnar walked her to the door. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. His face carried something she had not seen in it before. Not the confidence of a man who knew he was right. Something closer to the uncertainty of a man who was realizing he had been wrong. I told people you would both be dead before January. His voice was rough. I spoke with certainty I had not earned. Sigrid said nothing. She waited. Gunnar looked past her, at the snow, at the sky, at the world that had just tried to kill his family. My grandfather. His voice changed, became quieter, more distant. Back in Minnesota, he built into hillsides. His eyes were somewhere else now, somewhere decades ago. I remember visiting as a boy, running my hands along walls just like the ones you built, not understanding at the time what I was touching. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with the cold. I came to Nebraska territory and I built the way people told me to build. The way the lumber yards sold lumber and the hardware stores sold hardware. The way the frame house plans in the farm journals prescribed. He paused. Somewhere between Minnesota and Nebraska, I let the knowledge of what my grandfather had done become the kind of memory that feels more like a story than a fact. His eyes found hers. We come to a new place and we forget everything the people before us figured out. We think new tools mean we are smarter. He was not saying this to compliment her. He was saying it to himself, working through something in real time. The way a man does when a belief he has held for years has just been disproven. Not by argument, but by evidence he was currently living through. But you remembered. Sigrid nodded once. I remembered. Gunnar was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped back. Thank you. For coming. For the wood. For showing my children that help comes even to people who did not deserve it. She left. Fenrir followed. And as she walked away through the snow, she did not look back. But she knew something had changed. In Gunnar. In the way the community would see her, in everything. From Gunnar's property, she went east to Heinrich Brenner's stone house. The beautiful stone house. The finest structure within 20 miles. It was standing without visible structural damage, because the stone walls had resisted the wind the way they were designed to, and it was cold inside for precisely the same reason. Stone conducted heat. Every degree of interior warmth ended up on the exterior surface, radiating out into the frozen air. The interior temperature when she arrived was 26 degrees. Heinrich's youngest daughter, a 7-year-old named Marta, had frostbitten toes from sleeping in a room that had not reached above that temperature since the first night of the blizzard. Heinrich opened the door and stood aside to let her in. With the expression of a man who has been a professional and is currently standing in the ruins of the argument his professionalism had made. He said nothing that required a response. Sigrid went to the child and assessed the toes with the practical seriousness of someone who had been reading everything she could find for 2 years, and who had, in the farm journal collection at the Trading Post, read a section on cold weather injury and its treatment. She gave the same careful instructions she had given Ingrid, adjusted for the difference in the injury, and told Heinrich that the physician visit was not optional. Heinrich said something then, in the voice of a craftsman acknowledging another craftsman's work, without ornamentation, as a statement of assessed fact. The Lindqvist girl's design was correct. His voice was flat. My design was beautiful, but it was not enough. Sigrid nodded once and moved on. She moved through 3 more homesteads over the course of that morning. Fenrir stayed with her, a gray shadow in the white landscape, finding paths through the snow that she could follow. At the 4th homestead, a claim shack at the eastern edge of the settlement area, she found what Ezra Tate had predicted. The couple who had claimed it married the previous spring had apparently become disoriented in the whiteout conditions of the blizzard's second day, and had not made it back. They were found 47 feet from their door. 47 feet, which was to say they had known where they were going and had not been able to get there. The distance between knowing and arriving had been 47 feet, and the cost had been everything. Sigrid stood in the snow and looked at the place where they had been found, already covered by new drifts, already disappearing into the white silence of the aftermath. Fenrir pressed against her leg, whining softly. She did not cry, but she stood there for a long moment, understanding something about the margin she had been working within that she had not fully understood before. The infant death she heard about from Prudence Mercer, a woman she met on the road between claims. Prudence's face carried the specific expression of someone who has absorbed a piece of information they will spend the rest of their life rearranging around. 11 months old. Her voice was quiet. The Thornton family, the claim shack, had been drafty from the first day of settlement. She stopped, swallowed, continued. They managed through autumn with a stove that ran at capacity and the collective warmth of 3 adults in a small space. And in the blizzard, that calculation simply failed. She looked at Sigrid. The stove was not equal to the thermal loss rate of the structure at -40, and an 11-month-old body cannot compensate for the gap. Sigrid stood and received it without speaking, because there was nothing to say. The infant's parents had not been negligent or unprepared by the standards available to them. They had built what people built, maintained it as people maintained it, and the storm had been larger than the standards. That was the whole of the explanation, and it was worse than if there had been something more complicated to understand. Fenrir leaned against Sigrid's leg. She rested her hand on his head, and they walked on. Two people died 47 feet from safety. An 11-month-old baby died because a building method failed. Meanwhile, inside a hole in the ground that everyone had mocked, two teenagers and a dog had been warm and safe. What does that tell you about the difference between what people know and what people are willing to learn? The spring of 1877 brought 17 families who wanted to build what she had built. The consultations began in April when the ground thawed sufficiently to assess drainage and hillside orientation. And they continued through June. She charged $5 per consultation, which was not a small amount, but was not a large amount relative to the cost of getting the construction wrong. And every family who asked about the fee paid it without serious negotiation, because the winter had demonstrated in concrete terms what getting it wrong cost. Niels Peterson was among the first to ask for guidance that spring. Not for himself, but for his father, who had finally admitted that the frame house he had built 15 years earlier was slowly killing his family one winter at a time. Sigrid remembered Niels's questions during those 19 days of construction, the way he had stopped mocking and started learning. The chairs he had built for her without being asked. She did not charge him the $5. Some debts could not be measured in currency. Each consultation was different in its specifics, because each piece of land was different. The Peterson family had 6 children and needed 3 rooms, which required extending the excavation along the hillside rather than into it, creating a lateral structure that presented different load distribution challenges than her own design had faced. She worked through the calculations over 2 evenings, drew the dimensions, specified the timber placement, and noted the 2 places in the design where the standard approach needed to be adjusted for the specific geology of their hillside, which had a clay layer at 4 feet that would require additional drainage channeling. Torsten was beside her for every consultation, taking notes, drawing diagrams, learning. At 16, he understood the system well enough to explain it to others, well enough to check his sister's calculations, and occasionally catch an error before it became a problem. Fenrir accompanied them to every site visit. He had become a kind of mascot for the enterprise. People expected to see the gray dog, and they were not disappointed. The article ran in the Nebraska Free Press on January 20th, 1877. Edmund Holloway had come back on the 3rd of January with his notebook and something additional in his manner, a purposefulness that was different from the observational energy of his previous visits. He had spent the days since the storm moving through the settlement area systematically, with instruments, with a specific objective, producing numbers that could be compared. He had measured interior temperatures at 7 different structures at the same time of day on each of the post-storm mornings. He had recorded wood consumption figures from every household willing to provide them. He had documented structural damage and the correlation between damage type and building method. He sat at Sigrid's small table and opened his notebook and laid out what he had found. With the brisk, unornamented clarity of someone who has organized difficult information and is presenting it because the information needs to be heard. The average minimum interior temperature recorded during the peak of the storm in timber frame houses was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. In Heinrich Brenner's stone house, 26 degrees. Because stone, whatever its compressive strength, conducted heat outward with a thoroughness that wood did not match. In the dugout, 54 degrees at the lowest point recorded, with the fire reduced to minimal maintenance burning. The average wood consumption in timber frame houses during the storm period was 11 times the consumption recorded in the dugout. Several households had exhausted their wood supply before the storm ended. 2 of the 4 deaths were directly attributable to this exhaustion. The young couple had died because they had no more fuel and had tried to reach a neighbor. Edmund looked up from his notebook. This is not a story about a girl who made an interesting choice. His voice was steady. This is a document about a building method that kept people alive and a building method that failed to do so, with specific numbers attached to each outcome. He proposed an article for the Nebraska Free Press and a formal technical submission to the territorial government. The authors, he said, should be listed as S. Lindqvist, T. Lindqvist, and E. Holloway, in that order. Sigrid looked at him. Edmund's pen paused above the paper. Listing two teenagers as the primary authors of a technical submission to the territorial government would create friction. His voice was careful, the kind that might prevent the document from being taken seriously. He was not arguing against it. He was making sure she understood the bond before she paid it. Sigrid understood, and she was willing to pay. A document that obscured who had developed the method in order to make the method more palatable was making an argument about whose knowledge counted. That argument was worth contesting directly rather than accommodating. Edmund studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there satisfied him. All right, he opened to a fresh page and began to write. Reverend Josiah Whitfield came to the dugout on a Tuesday in late March, on foot, alone, without announcement. He had lost considerable weight since the blizzard. His wife had come through it without permanent damage, recovered to full health by February. But the winter had done something to Whitfield's certainty that health had not repaired. He stood in the doorway of the dugout that he had called inappropriate 4 months earlier, and looked at the interior with an expression that was not embarrassment exactly, but was close enough to it that the distinction did not matter much. Fenrir watched him from his spot by the stove, but did not rise. The dog had long memories, but also a capacity for forgiveness that humans might envy. I was wrong about you. Whitfield's voice was quiet. I assessed your situation and your choices through the lens of what I considered appropriate, and my lens had been poorly calibrated for what was actually at stake. He paused. Several families are alive who might not have been if you had built the way I told you to build. I am aware of this, and I wanted to say so directly, rather than let it remain unacknowledged between us. Sigrid considered him for a moment. Thank you for saying it plainly. That requires more courage than staying silent. Whitfield nodded. He said he would be returning to Massachusetts in April, that Nebraska Territory had asked more of him than he had been able to give it, that he was a man better suited to a place with established walls and established answers, and that he recognized this as a limitation rather than a virtue. He said she would outlast the territory itself, probably, and that this was meant as a compliment. She told him she appreciated his honesty and wished him a safe journey. He left, and she went back to work. Gunnar Holberg came on a Wednesday afternoon in late May, without his wife, holding a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. He sat his horse outside the dugout for a moment before dismounting, in the way of a man who has been deciding something on the ride over and has not entirely finished deciding it when he arrives. Fenrir came to greet him, tail wagging. Whatever history lay between them, the dog had forgiven it. Gunnar dismounted, took out the paper, unfolded it on the small table without preamble, and said he wanted to know if he had understood correctly. The drawing was careful and specific, executed in a hand that was better at physical construction than at graphic representation, but which had tried very hard to be precise. It showed a plan view and a cross-section of a structure he was designing for his brother-in-law, who had recently arrived from Minnesota with his family and was looking at a claim on the eastern side of the settlement area. The cross-section showed the double wall system with the air gap correctly positioned. The floor grade was noted in handwriting that read 1 inch per 6 feet. The chimney angle was labeled 30 degrees. He had gotten 80% of it right from observation and memory, without asking anyone for assistance, without referencing any document. Sigrid pointed to the first error, the drainage channeling at the base of the exterior wall, which he had positioned against the wall face rather than set back from it, in a way that would allow moisture to wick up into the base course of sod. She pointed to the second error, the chimney clay lining specification, which he had noted correctly in principle, but had specified at a thickness that would crack under the thermal cycling of the first winter. She explained both corrections. Gunnar listened, noted the adjustments in his own handwriting at the margins of the drawing, folded it, put it back in his pocket. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he spoke. I told people you would both be dead before January. It was a statement of record, not an apology, acknowledging a fact that existed between them and needed to be named, even if it could not be altered. I was wrong about what you were doing. I should not have been wrong about it. Sigrid said he could not have known for certain until the design was tested against real conditions. He shook his head slowly. That is true. but I spoke with certainty I had not earned. And there is a difference between being wrong because the evidence was ambiguous and being wrong because you were not willing to take the evidence seriously. He paused. The distinction matters to me. Sigrid said she understood the distinction and accepted the acknowledgement. He nodded once, stood up, walked to the door. He stopped there and said one more thing. I do not know why people set aside the things that work in favor of the things that are new. His voice was quiet. I was doing it myself without realizing it until the evidence in front of me became impossible to arrange around. He rode away. Fenrir watched him go, then returned to his spot by the stove. 2 weeks later, a sack of potatoes from the previous fall's harvest appeared outside the door with no note attached, and Sigrid understood what it was. The years that followed were not easy, but they were hers. Edmund Holloway proposed marriage in the summer of 1890. He did it in the practical manner that suited both of them, sitting at the small table in the original dugout, with the temperature outside at 72 degrees and the temperature inside at 63, which was a demonstration in itself. He said that they worked well together, that they thought about problems in compatible ways, that they had been producing useful work in collaboration for years, and that he saw no reason to stop, and that he would like if she was willing to make the arrangement permanent. She said yes, with the same directness she brought to all decisions that she had already thought through. They built a larger structure on her claim, 24 feet wide and 36 feet deep, 3 rooms, with skylights cut through the hillside above the rear rooms and a ventilation system that Edmund had adapted from mining principles he had been researching. The primary room had a ceiling height of 10 feet. The interior walls were plastered with a lime mixture over the sod surface, which produced a clean, light-reflective finish that addressed the darkness that had been the original dugout's most significant practical limitation. The structure was, by any measure available in 1890, more comfortable and more thermally efficient than any conventional house within 100 miles. They lived in it for 38 years. Torsten went on to study engineering at the State College in Iowa. He returned to Nebraska and spent his career improving and teaching the methods his sister had pioneered. He published a book in 1920, Earth-Sheltered Construction, a practical guide. It was based on 40 years of data that began with a 15-year-old boy recording temperatures in a composition book while a blizzard tried to kill everything above ground. The 4 children Sigrid and Edmund raised were healthy, which was not something she tracked consciously against any comparison group, until Edmund pointed out in the winter of 1896 that in 20 years of living in earth-sheltered structures, neither of them had lost a child to respiratory illness or cold-related injury. While the mortality rate among children under 5 in conventional housing on the northern plains from exposure-related causes ran at approximately 8% per winter. He said this not as a boast, but as a data point, the way he said all data points, and she received it the same way, as information worth knowing and recording. Fenrir died in the summer of 1889. He was 16 years old, ancient for a dog, ancient for a boy with wolf blood who had spent his life on the frontier. He went quietly in his sleep, lying in his spot by the stove that he had claimed 16 years earlier and never relinquished. They buried him on the hillside behind the dugout, with a small stone marker that Torsten carved. Fenrir, faithful companion, 1873 to 1889. Sigrid stood at the grave for a long time after the others had gone inside. Her eyes stayed dry, but her voice when it came carried the weight of 16 years of companionship that words could never adequately honor. Thank you for the years, for the warmth on cold nights, for the company when the silence would have been too heavy, for the way you always knew when I needed you close. She paused. You were a good dog, the best dog. Then she went back inside, made dinner, and continued with the work of living. Because that was what you did. You continued. She and Torsten documented 89 earth-sheltered structures across Nebraska territory and beyond over the next 4 decades. Each one an adaptation, a negotiation between the standard principles and the specific land, the specific family, the specific resources available. Some were more sophisticated than others. Some incorporated innovations that neither Sigrid nor her brother had thought of, contributed by the families who built them and lived in them and found solutions to problems that the original design had not encountered. A family in Montana had developed a passive solar supplement using angled reflectors that increased winter interior temperatures by 6 degrees without any additional fuel consumption. A homesteader in Kansas had adapted the double wall system to a prairie dugout on flat ground using packed earth berms that achieved nearly the same thermal performance as a hillside structure. These adaptations were documented and incorporated in Pass Forward because the method was not a fixed object. It was a set of principles that could be applied wherever people had the clarity to apply them. Sigrid Lindqvist Holloway died in October of 1928, 68 years old, in the original dugout. She had refused to move to the larger structure after Edmund passed 3 years earlier. She said she wanted to end where she had begun. Her youngest daughter, named Britta, for the grandmother she had never met, was beside her at the end. The newspaper ran an obituary that used the words architect and engineer without the qualifier self-taught, which Edmund had requested years earlier, and which the editor had agreed to because 4 decades of documented work supported the unmodified terms. The obituary noted the original dugout, the winter of 1876 to 1877, the technical submission to the territorial government, the 89 documented structures, the engineering publication, and the estimated number of lives that the method had preserved through the direct consultation work. A conservative figure that did not attempt to account for the structures built by families who had read the article or received the territorial guidance without any direct contact with Sigrid or her brother. The original dugout was occupied at the time of her death by her granddaughter, also named Britta, who had been born in the 3-room structure in 1903 and who had chosen when she established her own household to restore and live in the original rather than build something more conventional. In December of 1928, with the outside temperature at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior temperature of the original dugout measured 53 degrees without any fire burning. The thermal mass that Sigrid had built into that hillside in 19 days in November of 1876 was still functioning within 2 degrees of its design parameters. 52 years later, the Earth did not lose its memory of what had been asked of it. The structure finally collapsed in the early 1940s, the sod succumbing at last to the accumulated moisture of 6 decades of seasonal cycling. But the foundation excavation remained visible in the hillside, the precise dimensions of the original cut still readable in the earth. And a historical marker was placed on the site in 1952 that described it as the location where thermal mass construction principles were systematically applied and documented for the first time in North American prairie settlement. Engineers who studied the original design in the decades that followed were struck consistently by the completeness of the reasoning behind each choice. There were no elements of the design that existed for reasons that could not be justified on performance grounds. There was no convention followed for its own sake, no departure from the evidence available to her. Every dimension was what it was because she had worked out why it needed to be that dimension rather than some other one. And every decision traced back to direct observation of how materials and air and earth and heat actually behaved, rather than how received wisdom said they should behave. Sigrid Lindqvist had understood something that most people around her had forgotten. That of the knowledge of how to work with the land existed already, in the practices of the people who had lived there before the treaties, in the memories of families who had carried it from Europe and set it aside when they arrived, deciding that new meant better without checking whether the old had been working for reasons worth keeping. She had combined those sources without hierarchy, taking what was useful from each, because the standard she was applying was not about tradition or authority. It was about physical reality, and the physical world does not organize its principles by their origin. What she had built was an argument made in earth and timber and calculated angles and measured temperatures. An argument that genuine knowledge does not require institutional permission to be valid. That observation is a form of rigor when conducted with sufficient care. And that the most important question a person can ask about any received way of doing things is not whether it is traditional or modern or endorsed by the right people, but simply whether it works. And if it does not, what would work instead? She had asked that question at 17, with $250 and a hillside and a brother who believed in her and a dog who never left her side. The answer held at 53 degrees for 52 years. The earth has a memory longer than men. Her mother had told her that on a spring day in Minnesota, standing at the edge of a south-facing garden, looking at the soil that was already warming while the north-facing beds remained frozen. The earth has a memory longer than men, and sometimes the young remember what the old have forgotten. You do not need permission to be right. You do not need credentials to understand the truth. You only need to pay attention to what actually works, and the courage to trust what you see over what you are told.